So much of our understanding of energy production is dependent upon whether you're in an aerobic state or you're supplementing with anaerobic. And when we look at aerobic and anaerobic, neither is good or bad. It's just that we spend 95% of our time in the aerobic state, right? 95 to 99% of our life. And very rarely do we get the anaerobic state. We try to avoid the anaerobic state as much as possible. And not that we avoid it because we don't like it. The body tries to adapt to make things easy. If our body experiences things are stressful to us that require the utilization of the anaerobic system and that happens regularly enough, the body's going to adapt and say, hey, this sucks. Let's make our muscles bigger, faster, stronger, make ourselves more tolerant. Let's adapt so that when we do this activity, we can do it oxidatively. That's the long-term play for the body. So then what we do is we exercise, we create artificially harsh environments that are anaerobic. We trick the body into maintaining these adaptive processes in these tissues so that most of our life is stress-free. And not stress-free in terms of mental stress, but physically stress-free. The goal to maintain longevity is that most of the things that you do in your life, you can do so in an aerobic capacity. Not that you can't do anaerobic type activity, but like your ability to walk up and down stairs, do your daily tasks, just get on with life, and have a lot of reserve left over in case the shit hits the fan. Your body has adapted enough to make sure that you do it, operate it in the aerobic state. When you are in a situation where you're constantly visiting the anaerobic state, you are creating a downward spiral of stress, too much stress, and you're at the threshold of the tissues, and that's when you start the degenerative cycle of inflammation and failure, and then more inflammation, and then cancer and disease and death and all the nasty stuff that comes along with it. So this is why exercise is medicine, is that it's building up your resources so that the more you do in your life, the more you stay anaerobic. But anyways, the aerobic, anaerobic states are important, and this is again driven by exercise intensity. This is what determines if you're in a presence or absence of oxygen. So as you would expect, as your running speed or your exercise intensity increases, so does your oxygen consumption. And we actually saw this with our graph here that we've talked about so much, is that as you start to increase your exercise intensity, so you move from right to left, you start to demand oxygen and your body starts breathing more, your heart rate starts to increase, and you can only handle so much, and then your body has to shift to an anaerobic state. Because when you look here in the state here, your body's able to match all the oxygen. Remember, you never stop breathing, you're always breathing even here, but here indicates that your oxygen consumption is at its max, and the reason why you know it's at its max is because your body is supplementing with a large amount of the anaerobic pathway. Right? Remember, the anaerobic system is nothing more than a supplement to your aerobic system. And it's not that you're breathing less here, you're actually breathing more, you're consuming more oxygen, you're breathing heavily. It's just that in terms of total energy production, your body is relying heavily on the anaerobic pathway in addition to the aerobic pathway. And so remember, when we metabolize sugar, our byproduct of that is pyruvate, and if we're in fast glycolysis, we're going to end up with lactate aspect. And so as you see, as exercise intensity increases, so does carbohydrate consumption or carbohydrate utilization for ATP production. And then fat, triglyceride decrease. Not that you're not using fat, it's just that you're using more and more relative comparison of percentage of carbohydrate. I mean, you're still burning more fat here than you are here, because this is looking at percentage. Here you're only burning, let's say, 100 calories a minute or 100 calories an hour, whereas over here you're burning 800 calories an hour. So, right, it's a misnomer to think that you're not burning any more, or looking here you're not burning any more fat or carbohydrates, just that your total amount is higher, just relative aspect is lower because of the percentage of the carbohydrates being metabolized. But the takeaway from this slide is that the higher intensity activity you do, you're going to have an increased lactate production. That's the real takeaway. And if you start to have lactate production, as we talked about earlier, it's going to start to hit that lactate threshold where your demand or your production is out producing your clearance of that, and you're going to start seeing that in the blood. And then you see this other thing here too, is that you start to see oxygen increase, and then you get to the point where, your oxygen levels are at the top, but you don't stop exercise. You're still able to increase intensity. You're just able to do so because you're in an anaerobic pathway to support or supplement your aerobic pathway. So the relationship here is that as oxygen levels increase, as intensity increases, you're going to see lactate increase, particularly if you start to top out your VO2, you start to plateau here, and you get that lactate production. And as you would expect, the harder you work, the more energy you're going to need to produce that muscle contraction. And so all of this is dependent upon the availability of oxygen. And like I said, the goal really of a training program is to be able to do more stuff and still be in the oxidative state. So you want to get bigger muscles, better delivery, and part of this is this oxygen delivery component. And so when you look at oxygen consumption, this is based on three things. It's based on uptake, so getting oxygen from the air into the blood. It's based on delivery, getting the blood to the muscles, and this is based on extraction, getting oxygen from the blood into the tissues. And so that's how you end up with your ATP or power production. And this is stuff we talked about in the last unit, in the last chapter, with the cardiovascular system and cardiorespiratory system, and we'll look at in a little detail here. So this oxygen uptake, getting oxygen into the blood, this is first of all, the ability to adequately ventilate. So this is your breathing aspect. So did you transition from belly breathing to chest wall breathing, and are the muscles strong enough and have enough stamina to maintain that? And then the other aspect, things that are a little bit less out of your control, the hemoglobin concentration in the blood. Is there enough binding capacity? Are you hydrated enough? Are you eating enough iron? All these things that lead to your body's ability to get oxygen from the environment into the body. So the next thing is in the cardiovascular aspect and looking at cardiac output. So oxygen delivery, how effective is your heart and blood vessels at getting oxygen or getting blood to those tissues to use oxygen to stay oxidative? And this is where we got in the conversation of cardiac output, where we looked at the combination of stroke volume and heart rate. So we look at this cardiac output is this product, and it's dependent upon the nervous system and the hormones that are there, what kind of rested state you're in, what kind of stress state you're in, and then obviously your blood volume again, your hydration status, and then your vascular tone. Have you been sedentary and this is the first time you're working out, or has your cardiac muscle also adapted so that it can work more effectively at producing blood to the blood vessels? And then the last thing here is the oxygen extraction. This is really dependent upon the enzymes that are present at the receiving end of the blood in the muscle tissue. And so mostly your slow twitch muscle fibers, these are the ones that are working oxidatively, but your body adapts, right? As you start to train more, your body starts to put on more mitochondria. You start to get a higher concentration of enzymes to start breaking down fats and glucose. And so these are all adaptive processes that happen, and we'll talk about in two chapters from now. The circulatory system also adapts by developing new blood vessels to get more blood perfusion to the muscles so they can get this better exchange. So when you look at, when I had mentioned before that you really can't change your blood volume, and you really can't change the oxygen capacity of your alveoli, but you can change your breathing mechanics and make your muscles stronger that way. And over time, your muscles do adapt to this workload by increasing its ability, basically increasing its furnace ability so it can utilize more fuel and produce more power. The more oxygen a person can take in, deliver, and utilize, so what we just talked about, the more work they can perform. So the more they shift from the anaerobic system to the aerobic system, the more they're going to be able to do. They're going to get more bang for their buck. Remember, one glucose molecule metabolized anaerobically is only yielding 2 to 3 units of ATP. That same sugar molecule in the aerobic system is yielding almost 36 molecules of ATP. The hormonal consequences that exist, the stress response from the anaerobic system is much more volatile and stressful perceived than the response from the aerobic system, right? So the body's trying to do more and more aerobically. It's gentler on the body, and it's where the body prefers to be. It's a fairy tale to say that we'll live our entire lives aerobically, and if you never visit the anaerobic system, you're never getting hardened or never getting adaptive. So the way to get stronger, so you spend more time in the aerobic system, is by spending time in the anaerobic pathway, right? You have to do things your body's not accustomed to doing in order for the body to adapt. It's when you spend too much time there or don't allow enough recovery. So what this slide and this image is looking here is that as we talked about before, as exercise intensity increases, so does your oxygen intake. You're going to actually consume more and more oxygen, even though as your exercise intensity increases, you actually start to rely less and less as a percentage on your oxidative system and start to rely more on your glycolytic system. You do hit a point, though, where you have sufficient amount of oxygen to get to the point where your exercise intensity outpaces the demand of any one of those three things: oxygen delivery, uptake, or distribution. And so your body then relies not just solely on the aerobic system, but it has to supplement with the anaerobic system as well. And so you can see that you can still increase exercise intensity. You can still run a little faster or go a little longer, but you're doing so because of the anaerobic energy pathway. And so you're creating an oxygen deficit in this component. This is referred to as VO2 max. So that's the max amount of oxygen you can consume. This is dependent upon your, again, ventilation capacity, your alveoli capacity, your blood flow, your cardiac output, any of the aforementioned aspect. But nonetheless, you're using the anaerobic pathway, and so you're borrowing against oxygen sufficiency, right? You have an oxygen deficit. So this is your energy pathways here, and you can kind of see the same thing too, is that this is oxygen intake, oxygen consumption. You have plenty of oxygen to do what you need to, but you're on this end, when you're using the anaerobic system, you are borrowing, you're creating an oxygen deficit or oxygen debt. So you start exercise here and you kind of look through there, you hit steady state, so you are getting this energy, this oxygen deficit that at some point has to be paid back. Okay, so you have the start of exercise here, and you have the end of exercise here, and as we showed in the previous slide here, when you are working glycolytically or anything in the anaerobic state, you are creating an oxygen deficit. So whether you're working in the phosphagen system or the glycolytic system, you are doing more than which oxygen is available, right? You're over in this aspect. And so you are still able to increase exercise intensity, but you're doing so, I mean, you're still aerobic down here. This is all aerobic down here. This is all oxygen intake. You're anaerobic above it. And you look here, same thing. You're aerobic down here. You're never not breathing. And so you have this oxygen deficit. And at some point, you create this oxygen debt that has to be repaid. And so if you look at your resting metabolic rate is down here. You're always consuming a certain amount of oxygen. This is the energy that you need just to maintain. And we saw with the thermic effect of food and the energy balance equation that this can make up 70% of your total energy output. Then you have an onset of exercise, and let's say it's intense exercise. So you are doing, as you start to increase your exercise intensity, so does the demand for oxygen because you have demand of ATP. And then once you stop exercise, you would think that it comes back down to your normal resting metabolic or your breathing rate, but it doesn't. You can see that there's a certain time period of recovery, almost as long as the exercise itself, that your body's at a higher breathing oxygen consumption, so higher metabolic output, to basically repay that debt that you created in that deficit. And so this oxygen debt deficit intake relationship is referred to as EPOC, which is exercise post oxygen consumption. And basically what happens is that you're at rest, you have a certain amount of VO2 being consumed, and as soon as aerobic exercise, in this case aerobic exercise, begins, you start to get the sympathetic nervous system stimulates an increase in cardiac output. You have epinephrine and norepinephrine that dilates blood vessels. It starts to change your breathing mechanics, so you go from belly breathing to chest breathing. And this takes about 2 to 4 minutes for the body to meet these increased demands for oxygen. Once it does, it's able to fully match everything in the aerobic state. So even with aerobic exercise, you're still creating a little bit of oxygen deficit. So here you start exercise, you actually get the glycolytic and the phosphagen systems kicked on to start supporting, because you're actually working out a little bit anaerobically. And then in about 2 to 4 minutes, your body's able to reach the steady state because now the heart's pumping harder, you're breathing heavily, and the blood vessels have dilated. And now you have sufficient O2, and you can work out 100% aerobically, or mostly aerobically. Once exercise stops, though, you have this debt to have to be repaid because you had this deficit, and so for you have 15 minutes of exercise, theoretically you're going to have almost the same amount, 15 to 20 minutes of increased metabolic output to repay this oxygen deficit. This is you trying to maintain an aerobic activity. When you look at this deficit here, again, the onset of exercise, and you had this debt. In this case, you were working out aerobically as much as possible, but it still took a few minutes, 2 to 4 minutes, to pay back that debt. When you do anaerobic training, you can see that the debt is huge, right? You got a huge deficit. You're not working out as long, right? 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes tops for that aerobic aspect. But you can see that you have this large deficit to pay back. You can also see that this curve is exponential. So majority, 90% of it is paid back in the first, within the first hour. But this can be up to 2 to 3 hours, sometimes even a full day, depending upon how your training went, that it does to repay that that oxygen debt. So it's not so much energy that you're burning during exercise, but also energy post-exercise that can be contributing to that. Some of the things that are happening during this recovery, especially with the anaerobic pathways, is your creatine phosphate restoration, right? Remember, creatine phosphate is about 10 seconds worth of activity, then it's spent, and your body needs about 3 to 5 minutes to replenish all your ATP. That's also why when you're trying to train for more power and more neurological adaptations, that you have about 3 to 5 minutes in between sets when you're doing singles, triples, or five. Let's say you're doing a 5x5 routine. You're not going to do 5 reps and then wait 30 to 60 seconds to do it again. You're going to do 5 reps and you're going to wait 3 to 5 minutes to allow full replenishment of the creatine phosphate to regenerate. It's happening here in this post-exercise consumption. Same thing with glycogen. Glycogen can somewhat be restored, right? Your liver is producing glycogen. You have that lactate accumulation your body's trying to do, and your body can go through gluconeogenesis. It can create fat, or can create sugar from some of the glycerol molecules that are from the fats, or from any amino acids, or let's say some of the sugar that you have floating around in your blood from what you ate a couple hours ago. So all this is happening during this post-exercise recovery. This is also the time where you want to maximize. Let's say you are an athlete and you want to maximize your recovery. You are going to try to top off and fully saturate your creatine stores, and you're going to try to do the same thing for your glycogen, your carbohydrate stores. Make sure you have as much carbohydrate as possible there for your next bout or your next activity. Your textbook kind of goes into the repletion of the muscle glycogen, and that the optimal amount of consumption is anywhere between 0.7 and 3 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. And this is ingested every 2 hours following exercise. And the amount of time that you do that is usually based on how long of your activity that you've done. Now, if you're not an athlete and you're looking to resensitize, and maybe fat loss is your goal, you're probably not going to eat any carbohydrate post-meal, right? You're going to try to ride that wave out to allow most of that coming from fat and stored fat, or from energy coming in. And then if you're training for, let's say you're a bodybuilder training for mass, or you're looking more at size, you're going to want to do that carbohydrate post-workout to get that insulin spike. And again, we'll talk more about that in the next unit. But again, we look at the this whole component of this EPOC and this O2, and the big takeaway from this is that it's not just the energy that you expend during your workout, but also post-workout that can have an effect on your metabolic output and your success in training. So it's and the bigger deficit that you create, the bigger debt you're going to have to pay back once you're done with that aspect. So that's really the takeaway. So that's pretty much it when we look at this cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory, and oxygen aspect. And you remember this slide here. This is looking at cardiac output and looking at blood flow. And again, the reminder here is that the muscle is the largest recipient of that cardiac output. And the thought process here is that the cardiovascular and the cardiorespiratory system, it serves the musculature during activity. The heart is a servant to the muscular system, not the other way around. So when you're doing cardio, it's not that you're doing cardio, it's not that the heart is working, it's that the muscles are contracting and using energy and working out oxidatively. They need oxygen. And so the heart just supplies the working muscles with that. So to say that exercise is cardiovascular is kind of an interesting aspect. It's the increase in muscular activity that demands more resources for ATP production, and the EPOC post-exercise requiring the heart to increase cardiac output to meet these new demands. So it's not the heart that is really being trained, it's the muscles that are being served by the heart. And so what's interesting is that even if you're working out anaerobically, right, and that just means that you're working out aerobically and aerobically, not just aerobically. So when you do a squat, even if you're doing 5 or 6 reps, you're still dependent upon blood flow to clear that out, right, with the EPOC and so forth. So I would argue that all exercise is cardiovascular exercise, right? Because we want to make this comparison of resistance exercise versus, oh, I did my cardio today, I did my resistance exercise, but really, all exercise is cardiovascular. There's no way you did a set of squats for a set of 10 and your heart rate wasn't going through the roof, right? People always want to think that cardio needs to be like this long duration aspect, and has been proven by CrossFit and been proven by high intensity interval training that there's more effective ways to burn fat than to do like long duration cardio. And in fact, I would argue that long duration cardio is probably the worst way to do that, right? That your heart, and you look at those sports that I pulled up there, unless you're doing some crazy endurance running, which is a sport, not a fitness aspect, we really don't do sustained cardiovascular activities, right? Which is like bursts of high intensity activity followed by recovery, and a burst of high intensity activity followed by recovery. Even soccer that has a lot of running, you have a sprint followed by a jog, and a sprint followed by a jog. Football, sprint for 10 seconds and then back to the line. Sprint for 10 seconds and back to the line. It's all this high burst of activity and low. Even basketball, right? You kind of sprint down court and you kind of do your things a little bit here and there, and then bang, you're back to the other side. You're getting a few 30 to 90 second rest periods built into that. So all exercise is cardiovascular exercise, and all exercise is resistance exercise. So this resistance exercise and aerobic exercise are really bad terms for this, right? You are always under the force of gravity. It doesn't matter if you're walking or jogging or sprinting, you are producing muscle force, muscle tension with demands and resources supplied by the heart. And so all exercise is cardiovascular and all exercise is resistance exercise. What really matters is the intensity, right? And not intensity like, oh, something you can do for 10 seconds, or it is this intensity is, the energy systems are intensity dependent, high versus low. And so it's not just something you do for 15 seconds, but it's something you can only do for 15 seconds, right? It's like using a weight that you could lift 20 times, but you only do it 5 times, and you wonder why you're not getting any stronger, right? You need to lift a weight that you can only do 5, and you couldn't do any more. You try to get your 6th rep in there, and that's it. You pooped out. You can't do it, right? And so you can take a squat and do it where you put enough load on there where you only do it for 15 seconds, or you can put a squat on there where you're doing 100 reps and you're doing it for 2 minutes, right? It's not the exercise, it's the intensity, the effort that you put forth, and that's what matters. So we look at the energy systems here that are intensity dependent, and then in the future we're going to look at this as the hormonal response, thus the adaptations that are also intensity dependent, and intensity is everything. If you are not exposing yourself to things that your body is not accustomed to doing, aka high intensity, you're not doing anything. And you want your body to adapt to these high intensity environments so that you get the changes, or more importantly, your clients get the changes that you need. And again, it comes back to this graph here where we're looking at how intensity affects the energy system you're in, and then as we're going to connect, the energy system you're in also leads to a hormonal cascade, and this affects the adaptations that you're going to make. It's also going to affect the outcomes, and then it's going to drive your nutritional plan. And so now we're going to start understanding the science behind why we're doing everything, and it starts with this graph right here.